Today we are talking with Michael Lynch, the author of Internet of Us, Knowing More and Understanding Less in the Age of Big Data. Welcome to Radara.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. You have a very interesting book and very interesting title as well. There's so much information that has been available to us, and it's very easy and accessible to us. And just because we have information doesn't mean we understand, and doesn't mean we even have knowledge. What is the central theme of the book? What is that you're trying to convey in the book?
So we live in a knowledge economy, we say now. We have knowledge workers. We think of knowledge as a sort of central concept in our economic and personal lives. But what sort of knowledge are we producing, and what sort of knowledge are we consuming? Those are the questions I think we really should be asking, and those are the questions that I want to ask in the book. In a more personal way, what the book is about is how you and I are acquiring information and maybe or maybe not knowing things as a result of our digital lives. I think technology has become so integrated in our lives, certainly in my life, that it's changed my habits and ways of acquiring information, and it's changed those habits and ways so quickly that I felt like when I first started writing this book that I hadn't really had a moment to sort of catch my intellectual breath and think about the impact that those changes have made on my life, not just in a daily life, but in the life of the mind. So one way in which this comes up in the book is and sort of impacted how I began to think about the book and why I began to think about it is a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, I guess now, I decided to see if I could answer 4 questions from my life without the use of the internet at all. And this turned out to be, I thought it was sort of just a silly little experiment, in quotes. But it turned out to be interesting and revealing, I think, and really spurred me on to continue this research that the book is about. You know, basically, very briefly, the questions were, as I said, just ordinary questions from my life. They range from a question about how to contact my local congressional representative, to a question about mechanics, about how one engine is different from another engine, an outboard motor, to questions such as
capital of Bulgaria.
The capital of Bulgaria, that's right. And what's the best reviewed restaurant in Austin, Texas right now? And, you know, some of those questions turned out to be very easy to answer without the internet. Capital of Bulgaria, I was able to find an old atlas in my house, looked it up. I was a little worried that it might have been out of date, but, you know, it seemed good enough. I counted that as a win. The question about the engines, well, I went down and talked to a mechanic, and that didn't work out quite as well because normally I would record something like that with my iPhone, but I didn't because part of the rules was that I couldn't use the internet and I couldn't use any digital device. And so I didn't really get retain much information from that because I didn't take sufficient notes. But still, you know, it was good enough. I was able to figure out, and in some ways it was better. I was actually able to talk to somebody, and they were able to show me how this particular engine worked. Then when I came to the question of how to get my number for my congressional representative, I went to my local library and I asked the kid behind the desk whether they had that information. And he said, sure, the computers are right over there. And I said, no, you don't understand. I can't use the internet. And to which he said, okay, in that tone of voice that, you know, meant like, okay, crazy person. And so I explained what I was doing, and he was like, okay, that's pretty weird. But we found an old phone book. Actually, it was underneath the desk at the library. I was just sitting there, neglected, and we were able to find the information that way. And then when it came down to the question of what's the best reviewed restaurant in Austin, Texas right now, I was going to Austin, Texas, and I was planning on going at that time. And, you know, that's a question that we wouldn't even entertain without the internet. You know, what do you mean the best reviewed restaurant right now? I mean, travel books used to give us advice on restaurants, but, you know, of course that was never current. And the idea of even asking that question, reviewed by who, we would ask. So, I mean, what this whole experiment showed me is that the changes that the internet has brought with it, with regard to how we absorb and process and sort through and distribute information, have really come so quickly that they've changed our attitudes towards the concept of knowledge itself. I mean, the whole process sort of felt, as I say in the book, like dressing up in period costume. I've never done that, but it sort of felt like the intellectual equivalent of that. And yet the weird thing is, of course, is that, as we both know, that these changes have happened so rapidly. So that's how I sort of got into the book. That's the way in which I got into it was really through a sort of personal experience like that really motivated me to pursue this further.
Yeah, the speed with which this is becoming accepted is that we no longer seek out information, we only download information, or as you say in the book, it's the downloading of facts, and as a result, our level of skills, certain skills that were necessary or ingrained in how to go to a library, where to find it, and then collect it, and then record it, and then bring it down, and then make a mental note of it, that whole process is done within a fraction of a second sometimes now.
Indeed. And in many ways, of course, that's a great thing. That's why, the subtitle of the book is Knowing More and Understanding Less. Well, I mean the first part. I mean, we do, in a sense, in one sense of knowledge, in this quick downloadable sense, what I call Google knowing, we do know more. We have access to far much more information than we did before, and we have it, as you just emphasized, at much greater levels, degrees of speed. And sometimes people overlook the importance of the speed aspect of it. They think, well, it's really, trusting, when you look at something up in a library, you're still trusting somebody else. It's just a slower, looking things up on the internet is like just a slower version of looking something up in a library. But, well, to some extent, that point is true. It's important to realize that the speed makes a qualitative difference as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, saying that this would be sort of like saying, with regard to the automobile, well, automobiles, they're really not that different than horses. Right? They're not that different. They get you places. Horses got you places. What's the difference, really? One goes faster, right? But in fact, there is a difference. There is a difference in the very fact that speed is so much, just as an automobile, the speed frees us up to do certain things and make certain things possible that would have never been possible before. And just as my little story I just told hopefully illustrates. I think the other thing that's really distinctive about how we're knowing and Google knowing now is over and above the speed is the fact that our ways of knowing are often directed by forces that are unseen to many of us during our ordinary digital life day to day. By that I mean that many of the searches we make on the internet and the apps that we use present us with information that is partly the result of often machine-generated algorithms that are based on other people's preferences. So when you, for example, even search on Google, and again, I don't mean to pick on them. This is just true of, this is true as I could give you an example from apps as well. But the most easy example is to think of when you're searching on Google and you write in a question or a search term, Google will suggest, using a proprietary software called a program called Google Complete, they will try to complete your sentence. They will try to say, well, you're searching for climate change right? And they'll prompt you, as we all know. Now, those prompts, how do they know about those prompts? Well, because Google tracks both how you personally have been searching the internet, but also how other people who have been using those same terms have been searching. So, for example, if you right now were to Google climate change, you'll see that they'll prompt things like, often the first thing that'll come up will be climate change and hoax, ? Right? Climate change and theory, and so forth, climate change facts. And what this indicates is that other people's searches, right, are partly determining where you're finding things and what you're finding on the internet and what comes up first. So that means that you're searching, it would be as if you had gone to the library, and when you got to the library, what you see on the shelves is changing due to your own interest, but the interest of other people who have also been at the library. And that, of course, that means that which, as it were, books you're taking down off the shelf are there partly because of these, as I said, unseen forces. And that's not necessarily sinister, but it is a fact that we need to understand as impacting the quality of information, the type of information we have access to.
So much of information consumption that happens today is based on how other people are consuming information. So what you're saying is our rate of absorption or our process of absorption is so much dependent on how others have absorbed it in the past, and that could be only 2 minutes ago or 2 minutes before.
Exactly. And you're exactly right. And that's how the speed and other people's preferences really make Google knowing so distinctive. What's distinctive about how we're knowing now is exactly that combination of factors that we have. We're able to access this information so quickly, and yet, bizarrely, it's also information that is being affected by the choices of other people. And the speed, of course, also allows us to integrate this way of knowing into our way of life in the same way that we often sort of regard perception as perception is integrated into our life, that is seen. I mean, we used to say, right, that seeing is believing. Nowadays, we tend to think Googling is believing. How many times have you been to a party, a dinner party, or at work, or at a bar, and somebody says something mildly contentious, and everybody races for their smartphones to see who can find out whether it's true or false. And that's not necessarily bad. It can even be great sport. It can be really helpful sometimes to call people on their BS by consulting Wikipedia. But it also shows that we're treating the internet as a sort of our default go-to source of information. Even at the same time that any adult that you talk to will say, oh, well, of course I don't believe everything on the internet. So we have this sort of very funny, very somewhat contradictory view towards the internet. On the one hand, we are suspicious of it, or most of us are. On the other hand, we use it on a daily basis. The average adult makes dozens of searches on Google every day. And that's pretty interesting fact about how we relate to information right now.
You're very true, one very funny and one very serious in the book, anecdotes and one cartoon there. It says, you know everything, but do you really understand it,
Right.
And then you have this very nice description of a relationship between Socrates and Plato. And there you talk about that Socrates was all about understanding and not about knowledge. Would you go a little bit more and deeper so those who haven't read the book, they have a little bit better understanding where you were coming from and all the distinctions where you were making along the way as well?
Sure. So I think when we talk about, knowledge and information, as a philosopher, the first thing I want to do is to sort of distinguish these things. And we might even start with data. When we talk about data, we're talking about really the raw material of our digital life. That is the ones and zeros, the code that comes both streaming in and out of our smart devices as we walk around. But we need to abstract information that is content, meaningful content from that data. And we use data analytics to do that, but just our own brains as well. So that's the difference between data and information. Information is the meaningful content that comes from data. But of course, information is not the same thing as knowledge, because information can be good or bad, true or false. And even true information isn't really the same thing as knowledge, as Socrates pointed out, because of course somebody who makes a lucky guess doesn't really know. We don't think that people who make a lucky guess, that might be fortunate, but not knowledge. Somebody knows when they have true information, but that information is grounded or warranted in some way. It has supported by some evidence. And there, of course, is the tricky bit, because where do we get the evidence? And that's where our previous discussion was really about the ways in which we acquire evidence nowadays online. But I think that while knowledge itself, that's sort of a helpful way, sort of, cliff note sort of way of thinking about knowledge. It's true information that's grounded or warranted. information can be grounded or warranted in different ways, and therefore knowledge can come in different forms. And some type of knowledge can be of the sort of knowledge that we were talking about before, that sort of knowledge that we acquire by accessing reliable sources, whether it's on the internet or not. And we can do that, in a sense, by downloading the information from those sources. But that sort of knowledge is very different from an active, much more creative, active knowing, which I call understanding. Understanding is the sort of understanding that, the sort of type of knowledge, rather, that I think Socrates was after in the various early dialogues of Plato, where what Socrates was interested in wasn't just, accessing the sort of facts about certain things. He wanted to know how the dots connected. He wanted to know what depends on what. And an example of this that I give later in the book is from a famous dialogue called the Euthyphro, where Euthyphro was a pretty allegedly pious person who was so pious, a sort of religious fanatic, and he bumps into Socrates in the dialogue. Socrates is actually waiting outside the law courts because he's waiting for pretrial proceedings to begin in his own trial for corrupting the youth. And so he's sitting outside in Plato's Republic, in Plato's dialogue and the Euthyphro, and he bumps into Euthyphro, who's hurrying up to go to the law courts to prosecute Euthyphro's own father, actually, for religious crimes. That's the sort of guy that Euthyphro was, right? or so at least Plato represents him in the dialogue. And so Socrates says, Euthyphro, could I talk to you for a minute, because I'm trying to figure out what piety is, what holiness is, and you're an expert. Maybe you could tell me what it is. And Euthyphro sort of sniffs and says, it's obvious what it is. It's what holiness is, whatever is loved by the gods. And Socrates says, right, holiness is what is ever loved by the gods. But wait a second. What does that tell us? Does that mean that whatever is holy is loved by the gods, whatever is God's love is holy, but what depends on what? Is it that the gods create what is holy by loving it, or are they like super holiness detectors, right? Just telling us that there's a correlation between holiness and being loved by the gods doesn't really tell us anything deep. It just says these two things go together. That's helpful, but it doesn't give us the deeper understanding of how the gods' views are related to the things that they love. And that is a deeper sort of knowledge that I think that Plato was right to think that we need to pay attention to. When we're asking questions in life, sometimes we just want to know the sheer fact. We want to know perhaps just the correlation. This goes with that. Other times, though, we want to know what the causes are, what the whys are, what the hows are. And those are harder questions to answer. And those are questions that, of course, science is I think, aimed at trying to figure out. Is the hows and the whys. But even in our daily lives, we want to know these hows and whys. We want to understand not just that our spouse gets upset when we mention this topic. We want to understand why that's the case. And we want to understand why a person is feeling bad, not just that they are. We want to understand why a particular disease spreads, not just that it does. And that sort of knowledge is much more difficult to acquire. It requires skills. It requires the ability to ask certain sorts of questions and know what follows from what. And it requires a sort of creative synthesis, an ability to put information together. Somebody who understands something knows how, as I said, to connect the dots, how things hang together. And that's something that requires effort. It's not just passive downloading of information.
Yeah, and thereby the subtitle, the more you know, less you understand.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that happens in our contemporary life is because we have so much information available to us, and therefore so much Google knowing that's so easy, that's great. That's incredibly powerful and has been a really great thing for many of us on a daily basis. But at the same time, that tends to make us what I call epistemically overconfident. It tends to make us think that we know more than we do and in deeper ways than we actually do. It tends to get us, I think, to overlook the value of this deeper sort of knowledge of understanding. It's not that understanding goes away, and it's not that Google searches or this buzzes off of my smartwatch or any of the ways in which I interact with information digitally can't be a good basis for understanding. Of course they can be, but they aren't to be confused with understanding itself. Understanding is a personal creative act of cognitive effort. And that's something that requires, let's say, more autonomy on our part than this passive sort of reception of information that we are so good at now really does.
What has happened with so many of us, including me, is that because it's so easy and because the information access is so pervasive and available, that's all we do. And we consume ourselves with social media sites like Facebook and Instagram and all the others and Twitters and so on. But most of the twitting comes after Googling. And most of the Googling leads to twitting, which sometimes also leads to Facebooking and so on.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And we have become so dependent on the digital way of searching information and then not spending enough time away from the screens and trying to understand what it means and then turning into knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that as a result, we see certain consequences that are happening for our society as a result of this. Not only is this phenomenon happening, but it has certain effects that are worth paying attention to. Some of those effects include what we were just talking about, is this sort of sense that we're losing our capacity for a deeper understanding about and sort of devaluing that understanding. We're not valuing that sort of understanding, that way of knowing as much. But there are other effects as well, and some of those have to do with the functioning of democracy. So part of what it is to live in a functioning democracy is that people are informed. The informed citizenry is a basic value of democracy. Whether that value's ever been realized or not, that's a different question. But that's a basic value that we have. We want our citizens to be informed in order to make good decisions at the ballot box. But what is it to be informed now? What does it mean to be informed? On the one hand, as we've been talking about, knowledge is so much more of a certain sort of knowledge is so much more prevalent now, and we can, as you said, Google, then we can share things on Facebook and Twitter, and all of us do that in our social feeds. And of course, the political election that's going on right now is a great illustration of how people will find things on the internet and then share them about the various things that are going on in the election to sort of further their own point of view. And that's in many ways fine. But of course, it shouldn't be confused with being informed in the deeper sense. Sometimes people tend to think, or so it seems, that participating in the sort of work of being an informed citizen sort of ends with sharing something from BuzzFeed on their Facebook page. But that's not right. And although all of us do it, including myself, even though all of us, that is, share things on Facebook that involve politics or other things without really looking deeply into what we're sharing and whether it's accurate, that can have a corrosive effect on the body politic. Part of those effects come from the fact that this sort of behavior leads to echo chambers and information bubbles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we seek internet just to reconfirm our own beliefs.
All right, exactly. The internet is the world's greatest fact checker and the world's greatest bias confirmer. And the greatest both at the same time. And indeed, we live in curated information bubbles. I think one of the things I'm trying to drive home in the book is that we can't avoid taking sort of some responsibility for this, each and every one of us. It used to be back in the 80s, there was a book that Chomsky came out with called Manufacturing Consent. And the idea was that, well, in the citizenry's information was being manipulated by the information they had by, big media, which by that roughly meant Chomsky at the time, the big three networks and some of the major newspapers. Which is, when you go back and look at that now, it's not that his basic point is exactly correct. But of course, nowadays, the big media in that sense, its influence is just one part of a much larger media landscape that includes all the technology companies, Google and Twitter, and all these things that Chomsky couldn't have imagined back in that time. Consent is still being manufactured, but it's now being manufactured, in a sense, by all of us. Twitter, after all, is a sort of source of media and information for tons of people, as is Facebook, as a Tumblr and a lot of other the sites that I participate in. But we curate our own information bubbles on these sites. We select ourselves the people that we want to share with, the people we want to be friends with, and we curate our own image on those sites. And so when we think about, well, who's to blame for the fact that we seem to be in this state of knowing more in one sense, but understanding less increasingly about politics, well, we are, in a sense. And part of what I'm trying to get us to see is it's not the technology's fault. It's our way of using the technology, and we need to wake up to that fact and start thinking of ways to use it more responsibly.
As you pointed out in the book, Bertrand Russell pointed out in one of his arguments in the newspapers that we need more than expanded access to knowledge. We need wisdom, which has to expand along with the access to knowledge, and sometimes we fail in that.
Yes, I think that's right. I think a good example on this score is the automobile. And Bertrand Russell himself, though, was thinking about something much graver, which was he was thinking of nuclear weapons technology when he was writing that in the 1950s. Now, I think both of those examples show that technology can be useful for certain purposes. Think of the automobile; it gets us where we want to go much faster than, as we were joking before, than the horse. But our valuing the automobile so quickly, our love affair with it, changed our life in ways that we didn't really notice until later. It changed our life, restructured how we live, literally, in cities. It led to us devaluing, in this country anyway, public transportation. And it led to, of course, increased pollution. Which is not to say that the automobile had all sorts of great things. It got us where we want to go in a fast, sexy, really independent sort of way. And that's been great, except in the ways in which it's not. And that's the sort of way in which I think Russell's warning is exactly pertinent. Information technology gets us where we want to go very quickly, but it also gets us to sometimes forget that there are other ways to get there. And we need to remember that and think about the consequences before we get to a point like we are with the automobile, wondering how it is that we managed to end up at this place where we're harming the atmosphere by using these devices, which got us, as I said, where we want to go, but in a particular way.
In the digital life that we live in, we leave footprints everywhere we go, and that means we are in many ways contributing to the information, big data as it's called now. And at the same time, our identity and our privacy are also changing and or getting affected. And I think you touch upon that very well in the book. If you want to expand on that, please.
Yes. So, I think that's a concern for many of us, and certainly an aspect of the book. As you noted, we all leave trails of information, tiny little sparks of ones and zeros trailing off behind us, the data trail, as we say. We do that because anytime we use the internet, and even when we're not using the internet, just carrying our phone around, our phone is constantly streaming out data that is picked through by algorithms to sort and provide information to the people who are making the apps that are on our phone, and in fact the manufacturers of the phone itself. And that leads to greater convenience. It allows us, it explains why, for example, that you can, when you search for things on the internet, and sometimes even when you don't, you'll see increasingly we have targeted advertising where you could go to the New York Times and the shoes that you've been thinking about are there being advertised on the Times. You could go to a variety of stores, and the mere fact that you walked into the store will generate information that the store can then use to create targeted advertising for you. So even though you haven't searched for anything particular item in that store, the fact that you were in the store or even perhaps paused in front of the store will generate targeted searches directed at you. And that in many ways is, of course, perfectly fine and convenient. But the fact that we are leaving these data trails, of course, has other consequences as well. The recent debates and ongoing debate about the NSA and their use of similar algorithms has rightly caused many of us to be alarmed about our privacy in the internet age. I think part of what I try to talk about in the book is, as a philosopher, is why should our privacy matter to us? What is important about privacy to us as human beings? Why should it even matter? Some writers recently have said that privacy is a dead value. The very fact we're so willing to share everything on the internet is an example of why privacy is a dead value, and we shouldn't really think that it matters. I think that's exactly wrong. It's completely the reverse of the truth. First of all, the idea that we share so much of ourselves on the internet. Well, actually, increasingly we don't share, as I was saying before. We curate. We select very carefully the images that we post on Facebook. It's not a coincidence that unhappy children are not to be found on Facebook. Only happy ones. And, only beautiful places are visited according to our Facebook feeds. We curate our lives on the internet, and we're not just sharing things blindly. We tend to post things about ourselves that present our identity in a certain way. And that means that really, why are we doing that? Because we actually are valuing, in a sense, our privacy. We want to protect it and promote ourselves in certain ways on the internet. The privacy still matters to us for a very basic reason, which is that invasions of our privacy we think of as icky, as weird, partly because, even though we may not think about this consciously, because they harm our autonomy. If I was to break into your house and read your diary, well, in a sense, what's wrong with that? Well, obviously something's wrong with it if I go on to, blackmail you with that information. The same if I broke into your iPhone. But even if I didn't do that, suppose I did nothing with that information, still wrong, you would say. Why is it still wrong? I haven't harmed you. Well, yes, you have. Yes, I have. I've harmed you because I have made certain decisions to share information with me, moot. I've made those decisions for you. And that's what happens when the government breaks into our phones or reads our emails or listens to phone conversations or just uses algorithms to sort through the relationships between phone conversations we have made. What's wrong about that is that it diminishes our autonomy. It makes certain decisions about what information we can share and not share for us.
In many ways, we are promoting and curating our own identity on internet, and that identity may or may not have any or little bearing to the reality. And that has a wider implication for society.
Yes, it does. As I was saying, I think that's exactly right. It means that our relationship to each other as human beings is it's always been curated. People curate their identities by what clothes they wear, what cars they buy, and so forth. But what social media has allowed us to do is to take that level of curation of identity formation and manipulation to a whole new level and to a wider audience. Now our audience for our curated museum shows of ourselves are not just our immediate friends and family, but in some sense the larger world. And that affects our attitudes towards what we're doing as human beings. How many times have you been where you've thought to yourself, you're taking photographs, right, of something that you're doing, and you're realizing that, wait a second, I'm not really living in the moment now. I'm just taking photographs. And why am I even taking these photographs? You store so many on your phone. How many of those do you actually ever go back and look at? Well, most of the time, people are often taking them to share on the internet, post on Facebook. And that, of course, leads to thinking of the event as something that's shareable. We tend to think of events nowadays in our lives, even events, with our children, as shareable. It's shareable or it's not shareable. That's a very different attitude. It's a way of thinking about something that's happening to you under those categories. Changes your relationship to it.
rather than enjoying it.
Rather than enjoying it or seeing it for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking about the ways in which it should be presented to everyone else. The ways in which it should be presented and the way in which it is might be very different.
So we become our own promoters 24 hours, 7 days a week, rather than being in the moment or taking time to connect with ourselves or our surroundings or with the people that we are close to.
Yes. So part of the understanding that I think sometimes we're understanding less is ourselves. It seems on the one hand we have more information about ourselves than ever before, not just information about other things, but we have all this information we can access about our own our past. Facebook goes handily now reminds you, here's a memory, they'll say, that you might want to share from 2 years ago. And that's sort of cool. You see, oh yeah, that photograph I shared, maybe I want to share that again. But it also means that just like with our knowledge of other things, that we tend to now think of that as the starting point for self-understanding. But that's not. We need to be careful with that. We need to remember that our ways of understanding ourselves are often revealed by our actions and our actions in the extra digital world. And we need to think about our relationship to events as they really are and experience them as much as possible for what they really are.
Mm-hmm. We all know a family, which we are all part of, that goes to dinner and everybody's texting to somebody, but nobody's talking to each other face to face.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Yeah. And it's, as I was saying, as a parent myself, my wife and I recently decided that, we're not going to take photographs and film everything that our daughter does, because the problem is doing that is, first of all, generating more information than we're ever going to go back and look at. And secondly, it removes us from the moment itself. And we'd rather be in the moment than share the moment, so to speak.
Very well said. One of the things I think you mentioned in that the central argument you have in the book is that how we know with technology, but more important is with how we should know with technology.
Right. So,
or without technology.
Right. So part of the main theme of the book is to try to get us to think about these ethical questions. And we often think of ethical questions as having to do with things like the death penalty or abortion or whether we should keep our promises or those sorts of things. And those are ethical questions. But there are also ethical questions about knowledge, how we should know, what sorts of ways of knowing are better for ourselves and for society. And that's some of the themes that we've been talking about. And I think the ethics of knowledge is something that should be of central importance to us now. We live in a knowledge economy, and we talk about knowledge workers. But the real questions we need to, or some of the questions we need to start asking is, well, how should we be knowing, and how should we be using big data? We are going to keep using it. There's no question about it. Technology is not going away. So that's not really, the book is not about technology going away. The book is about, and the technology itself is not either good or bad. What's good or bad is our uses of it. How should we be using it? That's the question we need to ask ourselves as a society.
Very well said. We've talked quite a bit about the topic in the book. Let's talk a little bit about the author of the book. How did you get involved in philosophy and then into writing?
So philosophy, like a lot of folks, I think, who go into college, philosophy is not often taught in high schools, and some it is. But when I went into college, I didn't know anything about philosophy. But after taking some courses in it, it felt to me like I had discovered the secret language of the world. It's a discipline that very much is oriented towards trying to figure out the deeper whys and hows of our lives and asking these ethical questions. And I think that really, as a young person, resonated with me. And I come from a family of writers and artists, and I'm the youngest of a large family. And to me, I guess in a way, I sort of always thought that I might do something in the life of the mind. But it was when I engaged in philosophy, I realized that this was my particular path into it. It was not through painting or fiction writing, but rather through philosophical thought. As far as writing goes, though, I've always sort of felt, as a philosopher, I've written books, both, for philosophers, books that, as one philosopher said, philosophers aspire to write, which are the books that are impossible to read, so to speak. I've written some of those books. The book that we're talking about now, I certainly hope is not one of those. I've also tried to, in my work, I've realized that some of the things that I want to talk about are things that people who are not professional philosophers like myself also are thinking about, the sorts of issues we're talking about now. And the realization that deeper philosophical questions about knowledge and truth are questions that all of us concern all of us as human beings. And I think because of my upbringing in the family that I was brought up in, I was always under the sort of expectation that when you talked about your ideas, you should be able to explain them around the dinner table, so to speak, to everyone else. And that's what I try to do in my writing now.
Mm-hmm.
Write in that sort of way that allows us to have an intelligent conversation, but one is that doesn't require all that much specialization and technical terms and things of that sort.
So currently, other than writing, what other activities, professional activities you're engaged in? You teach at university or?
I do teach at the university. I also direct the Humanities Institute here at the University of Connecticut, which is an institute, a research institute aimed at promoting and developing research across the humanities. It's an interdisciplinary research institute. We've just launched an exciting new project, which is actually where I'm going next intellectually, and is sort of feeding off the project we're in now. We just received a $5.75 million grant from the Templeton Foundation to examine the nature of public discourse, or the lack of it, in our country, and to try to figure out and promote research, engage in research on how to fix the problem of public discourse in our country, and to figure out what the barriers are to it. One of the things I'm concerned about is that democracies now really need their citizens to have conviction, and we have plenty of that in the presidential election cycle now, but they also need their citizens to have some humility towards each other, that is, be willing to sort of listen to each other. And that, I think, we have of less. And so a real puzzle is, how do we, as a democracy, how do we get to the point where we both have humility and conviction? And in fact, that's the title of the project.
You have written several other books. Would you care to let our authors know what are the recent few titles before this book was published?
So before this book, I published a book called In Praise of Reason, Why Rationality Matters for Democracy, which the title hopefully says what that's about, and pushes back on the idea that we can't really hope to give and ask for reasons in democracy, that democracy really is just politics, are really just war by other means. I push back on that and say that nope, in a healthy democracy we really can have and should have an exchange of reasons between equal citizens. Then an earlier book was called True to Life, Why Truth Matters. So that too was a book written at the beginning of the Gulf War, where I was very concerned to see that it seemed to me that the concept of truth was being ignored in the political realm and distorted by our politicians. I'm a philosopher who thinks that I'm a liberal progressive as a thinker and a writer, but I think that the left has done some harm to itself by not wholeheartedly embracing the notions of objective truth and rationality. I think those notions that are central to our life as democratic members of a democratic republic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to you and understand about how the book came about and what the book is all about. Just to remind our listeners that we have been talking to Michael Lynch, the author of Internet of Us, Knowing More and Understanding Less in the Age of Big Data. I hope if you do write a new book or next book, keep us in mind. We would like to talk to you more about and find out more about your next book as well.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you very much.